Oh, we're on?
Yes.
Okay, it says that we're on here. Um, okay, very good. How are you doing, Matt?
Excellent, excellent. I'm good this morning. How are you doing?
Great, great. Well, today we discussed chapter 13, and as it turns out, what are we in the 20th week of, or I'm sorry, this is our 20th session?
Yeah.
Wow. Wow, that's really neat. I'm really excited about the work that we're doing. And, as I mentioned, I'm excited to know that we are part of a tradition where different folks in the community are doing this kind of work. That's really neat to know that we're part of this tradition. Shout out to folks that are doing this kind of work in San Diego. Shout out to folks that are doing this kind of work in Mexico City. Shout out to other folks that are doing this kind of work and paying close attention to the relevance and importance of a Marxian-based analysis of contemporary realities. In chapter 13, which is what we're going to discuss today, Matt, Marx pays close attention to in fact, titles the particular chapter, at least as far as the translation that I have of Capital is concerned. He pays particular attention to the concept of cooperation. And what I'd like to do is, as we discuss, the components or before we discuss the components and the relevant concepts in the chapter, what I'd like to do is remind folks that have been following us and inform folks perhaps that are new to what we're doing, new to what we've been doing over the last 4 or 5 months since we've been quarantined. Remind folks that we're already familiar with an analysis in the preceding chapter about how the advances in technology have a corresponding impact on the arrangements and the capacities of capital to increase their quantities of surplus value, right? Increase their capacity at the economic level, right? Increase their capacity to increase profits, and correspondingly increase their capacities to exploit and injure labor. And so what Marx does in this particular chapter is he begins to address the ways in which these relationships and these capacities depend on arrangements, not just in individual factories or not just in individual shops or individual mills, but the relationship that these factories, mills, and shops have with corresponding ones, and how these relationships, right, function to control and generate the kind of economic objectives and consequent social impact that it has on workers and the communities that live in and around these factories and mills and shops. Anyway, that's what we're going to get into today. I wonder if I might ask you to talk about your upcoming poetic work, right? And ask you to talk a little bit about it so that it can set some kind of context without getting into the poetry itself, right? But ask you to think about, or ask you to share about your observations about space and the impact that these arrangements have on the people that inhabit these spaces?
Yeah. Well, I think oftentimes we actually get very short-sighted when we look around us and we look outside our window and we think that the view from outside our window is the entirety of the world, and that kind of creates a certain short-sightedness. And that I've always been very interested in that, how things are different in
Mm.
different parts of the world, and how oftentimes we don't realize that. But what this book is actually looking around at is that,
What
but the
book is
world,
this?
this next book, my next poetry book,
Okay. Okay.
City on the Second Floor. Now, it is my normal contentions. My normal thought is normally something I think about quite often, about kind of the arrogance that we often have, particularly people in the U.S., of
Yeah.
looking outside your window, thinking that the composite of the world outside is the world as a whole. So you begin talking about other countries and other places as though it just would replicate the power dynamics you find in America
Yeah.
in exactitude, right?
Yeah.
Which is not true. And I think that's a real, surreal, just real ignorance, often absolutely over our mouths. However, the world outside the world outside your view is a real place. You know, the world outside your window view is a real place, and
Yeah.
it's not something. And it's a place with dynamics, and it's a place that shapes your everyday experience. And it's not inherent. It's not normal. It's not the way things should be. It's a particular set of conditions
Yeah.
that we often take for granted as we move through the world. I mean, this makes sense. So I think that the book I'm trying to write is about how these kind of conditions set up the scenario of the choices that are even available to us, and we don't even think about it. We just don't think
Yeah.
about it. We just move through the process.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
go through the motions, and we normalize and we internalize all these types of activities um, that constitute um, the functioning of our exploitation. And so the city is physically built to exploit you.
Yeah.
It is set up to exploit you. The city would be built a different way if it were not designed for your exploitation, if it were not designed to keep this kind of beast of commerce moving, right?
Yeah.
It was
Yeah.
not set up not only for your exploitation, but for the exploitation of everyone around you. And in the case of Los Angeles, set up for exploitation on a global scale. We're talking about Los Angeles as one of the alpha cities of the world, right? So,
Yeah.
so much of the blood, sweat, and tears of a global proletariat are absorbed into the city of Los Angeles and then spread throughout the American market. I mean, this is the port of Los Angeles and San Pedro
Yeah. Yeah.
is the primary port for manufacturing from Asia. So like this is we're talking about sweatshops now. We're talking about global proletariat, and then not only the sweatshops that not only things that are produced within sweatshops, but the raw materials, the extractive labor that go in to bring raw materials into the sweatshops. So now we're talking about extractive labor throughout the globe, throughout
Yeah.
Latin America, throughout Africa, throughout the rest of Asia, and even throughout portions of Europe and the United States of America, for that fact. So we're talking about the blood, sweat, and tears of a global proletariat flowing into the United States and being held under the dictatorship of the commodity. Uh,
Yeah.
that nothing is produced or made, or no labor is called forth, if not for profit, and if not and the the most basic unit of making profit is to turn the is to turn air and water into commodities, is to turn them into sellable products. So that's kind of what the book's about. The book is about
Well, your attention to space and really your attention to the city, uh, uh, built on the second floor, right? Your attention to the city and the poetry that's going to surface, and that is surfacing already. I've already been reading some drafts of your poetry, and I'm really excited um, to see the final. I'm really excited about its completion, and then holding the book and then reading different poetry. But um, uh, what what such poetry and what such attention gives us the opportunity to do is not only to think about the design of space within the frame of our windows, the design of space within the frame of our doorways, but also to think about the design of space around the production and distribution of commodities. What I'll do is, before I get into this particular anecdote, I'll remind that Marx begins his book, chapter 1, with attention to a particular agricultural commodity, agricultural commodity and pastoral commodity. On the one hand, cotton as an agricultural product, right? And then wool as a related and tied product, in this case, to the sheep pastoral economy of England. And certainly this is a very useful and necessary point of reference in order to understand European and Western capitalist expansion and its impact, internationally. But I think that we can also, as Chicana and Chicano people, I think that it's also useful and certainly relevant for us to consider this model of analysis and think about it in terms of an agricultural product, an agricultural commodity, to think about it in relation to not just corn, right, but to the history of corn production. And I don't propose in the short time that we have when we meet for these for this 1 hour, I don't propose that we go back to the origins of corn production. What I do propose is that we think about the commodification of corn from roughly the post-war period, and not just the commodification of corn roughly from the post-war period and the commodification of other agricultural products at that time, but to think about how regions, cities, towns, how these towns were established and how they might be useful to think about not just the commodity itself, not just the commodity itself, but the arrangement of society, the arrangement of cities, the arrangement of major hubs, particularly in northern Mexico. In my case, I'm thinking about Ciudad Juárez, Chihuahua, which is the border town just south of El Paso, Texas, right? To think about how this hub, this border town as a hub, right, might be understood not just in terms of the language that's in the book, but also in terms of the kind of impact on the world views and things that become normal. What I often talk about in my sociology classes as epistemologies and ontologies, right? But to think about how these tensions, these forces, these impacts on society have shaped us as well. And not only us as Mexican people tied to this nation state called Mexico, but those of us who are part of the migrating flows of people that have made a presence for ourselves in the post-war period, made a presence for ourselves here on this side of the border. Anyway, that's where that's that's what I'd like to talk about. I don't know how much we can get into it, but anything that you might want to add before I get into this particular anecdote that I want to share?
I mean, there's simply no way of talking about the current period of time, in the economy of Mexico or the United States, on the subject of corn, without getting into NAFTA and with the free trade agreement there. Like many places in the world, we find a very, very absurd imbalance created by commerce. I mean, just created by simply created so that we can make some money. Mexico, I believe, last I checked, was the world's second largest importer of corn, importer, not exporter, importer of corn. And this is, of course, because people in Mexico have a diet based around certain just different variations of corn production, and have for time immemorial,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So that's why, right? So I mean, like there are similar examples throughout the world. I believe the Philippines is one of the greatest importers of rice, um, et cetera, et cetera. And there's many other examples as well. And so, like, but the fact of the matter is, the reason they're importing so much corn is because the Mexican diet there's a lot of corn in it, and so there is a market for this corn that must be that can be later that can be sold
yeah,
into Mexico. And so this is the world of commerce, wherein there is a imperialist, there is a vicious market-driven reason why people aren't allowed to live as they have lived
yeah,
for thousands of years, or for hundreds, tens of thousands, hundreds of years, hundreds of thousands, who knows, but have lived as they have always lived, um, because somebody somewhere else needs to make a dollar off their existence.
yeah, yeah. Well, I suppose that the way that I'd like to begin this anecdote is by uh, talking a little bit about oral tradition in my family. Uh, and, one of the conversations that I would have with my mother before she passed away was about my grandfather's work as, he had a little stand and he sold goods. He sold bread. He was a baker, of course. He sold bread and he had like a little corner store, right? Um, and so my mother, when she was very, very young, would accompany him to to the marketplace in Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua. Again, it's a northern border town in Mexico. And she would accompany him, and she'd share with me that on these visits and these trips to the market to buy things, so that my grandfather would then bring it to his store and sell it in the neighborhood, that the kind of products that arrived depended upon the seasons of the year. So there was the variety of fruits and vegetables with which my mother became familiar depend not just on the time of the year in which she and my grandfather were making their way to the market to buy things, but also on the seasons in which they were produced throughout the Mexican interior. And so I'd like to think about that, because the rise not just of this sort of economy in terms of small retail outlets, very small family-based retail outlets in neighborhoods that were basic to the sustenance of people in those neighborhoods, were central for the production and distribution and consumption of agricultural products in Mexico, but that there was this corresponding technological advancement and integration as part of this cooperation about which Marx discusses in this particular chapter that was introduced. That is that roughly before the Second World War in Mexico, and then of course leading up to the late 70s, there was the expansion, actually up until the early 70s, there was the expansion of the railroad industry in Mexico that allowed for the distribution of these commodities. And what I think is especially interesting for us to consider within the context of this industry is that both the railway industry and the services tied to the railway industry. And then, of course, the resources made available to corn producers and different other kinds of agricultural producers in the Mexican interior. These services and resources were made available as part of a legacy to the Mexican Revolution. However embattled that legacy was, and however embattled these resources and services were over the following decades following the Mexican Revolution, and tied to this, of course, was the corresponding presence of agricultural technical schools in Mexico, in various areas, right? That again, embattled as these technical schools were, that were set up and instituted to supplement and support and extend, to the extent that that was possible, the production and development and technologies around this kind of, commodity production. And folks might know that Ciudad Juarez, of course, in addition to being a place, an agricultural zone up until the mid 70s and late 70s, was also the place where an agricultural school was established. And what is really interesting, at least as far as my experiences are concerned, is that this agricultural school received students who got on the trains, in the nation, received students and from around the Mexican country. So as it turned out, when I was growing up and making trips to Ciudad Juarez with my family once or twice a year to spend, winter break and summer break, I had the good fortune to be in the company of some of these students. My grandfather's house was right next to the school. I remember it was called, at least that's how I remember, it was called La Cebollera, right? Which is a school, an agricultural school. I don't remember what its official name was, but that's what it was called, the Onion School. That was the name that it was given in the neighborhood. In any case, the students, some of the students lived in my grandfather's house. And I remember being very young and, peering through the door of the room where they stood when I heard them playing guitar and heard them playing the kind of music that was popular amongst young students, university students or college students in Mexico in the 1970s, which was actually a very tumultuous period for young people, and particularly college-aged students in Mexico. Of course, that was the period of Mexico's dirty war. In any case, I remember hearing music tied to the Mexican revolutionary tradition. And of course, I must have also been listening to music tied to the broader and larger scope of Latin American revolutionary traditions. But tied to these moments were two things that I'd like to talk about. And then I'll turn it over to your thoughts about this particular anecdote and its relevance to chapter 13. The first one, the first anecdote was that these were the same students that were writing graffiti on the walls of the neighborhood. Graffiti that was critical of the Mexican government at the time. It was Jose Lopez Portillo, and then following him was Miguel de la Madrid. And so there was a lot of graffiti, politically based graffiti about these particular presidents. And the impact, the negative impact that their presidencies were having in the region. And then also, and this is perhaps the more interesting, at least for the scope of the kind of discussion that we're having here, was that the same school was demolished. The same school was destroyed in the late 70s, if I remember correctly, and was destroyed as a consequence, late 70s, early 80s, was destroyed following a violent confrontation between police in the area and the students who had held themselves up in the school, and following shooting, rifle shooting between them, the students were defeated by the police, and then the school was closed. Right. And I remember on trips to my grandfather's home, the school at that point, the school that had been the place where we had gone to play soccer, in the front lawn, the school that had been the place that had informed me about politics, however much I could interpret politics in the 1970s as a child. The school that was a hub also for the training and the development of the agricultural economy following the Mexican Revolution and into that period of the century. That school was destroyed, right? And so the school was destroyed, and if I remember, I was in Mexico. The last time I was there was about 5 or 6 years ago, and that place now is a mall, right? Anyway, I'd like to stop there with that particular anecdote, and I'd like to know what your thoughts are about this before I get into a following discussion. What are your?
Well, I mean, the thing that comes to mind is, I mean, it's kind of interesting. What comes to mind is that when you are in when the economy or is extractive, or you live in the particular section of the economy that's extractive, violence it tends to be more immediate. It tends to be more immediate violence. It tends to be most immediate violence. In the global economy. I mean, like,
Yeah.
so for instance, like, in Mexico today with, with all the drug trafficking,
Yeah.
immediate kind of violence. Another example would be, the Congo, right, which it's got to call it coltan. And so this is, that's the liquid that goes into cell phones and various other forms of technology, and there's an incredible amount of violence. It's very immediate. And so that's immediate. But I'm thinking about, you're talking about, I mean, it's kind of a weird thought, but like, you're talking about the students living in the house of the teacher. And
my grandfather wasn't a teacher. He just rented out one of the rooms, one of the bedrooms in his home to some of these. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Okay, well, I was just thinking about just the more like informal setups and arrangements that you typically find you might find in Mexico, or you might find even in portions of America. But these more informal setups that are seen, that to the general American lens are seen as kind of like weird or odd or whatever. Yeah. And I just thought about that, and I just think about like how actually the way of doing things in America is very odd. The way we do things in the United States is very counterintuitive. It's very counterproductive. Yeah. It's just, but because it's so commodified, and I don't know of any group of people on earth who have as a commodified view of what you must do in life in order to be successful, in order to be quote unquote happy, in order to whatever, as people living in the United States. I mean, we are so thoroughly commodified, and there are portions of the world where the global proletariat have a much lower standard of living, a much more brutal police state, more brutal immediate police state to contend with. And of course, in the United States, the police state is felt unequally between people, and that's historically driven. But just generally speaking, there are places in the world where it's it's worse, right? There's places in the world where it's harder. But I don't know of any group of people that are so just thoroughly like just commodified. Their neurons have been commodified,
Yeah.
as the United States of America. The people living here, it's just so
Yeah.
the complete our, our wiring, the way we think about, like, like, I need my own, I need my own laptop. You could be like living, well, we're living with a home, folks, or
Yeah.
something like that. You need your own laptop. I need my own space. I need my own this. I need my own this. I need my own that. I need my own that. And like, so you end up spending all this money, you spend your time and your energy developing, just accumulating things that you don't actually need, that don't actually, whatever, but you need to get them in order to assert that you're a successful individual. It's just the way in which we operate is just, it's so
Yeah.
bereft of of of, um, of of not just like dreams and passions and whatever, but of basic function. It's just,
Yeah.
it's so absurd and wasteful, the way we in this country live.
One of the
That's just my immediate thoughts when you're telling this
yeah,
story.
yeah. What you're thinking about, of course, is how it is, our integration, if you will, and our presence and our incorporation in the architectures of capitalism have become the basis of have been the very ground upon which and from which we view the world and interact with the world. And then, of course, this ground becomes our misrecognized point of reference. The very ground becomes a kind of prism through which we view one another, view what is outside of our windows. This ground becomes even the prism through which we see ourselves reflected in the morning, right? And so what you're thinking about seems to me to be the ontological weight of the city, and then, of course, its corresponding impact on our interpretation of the world and our interaction with others on the basis of that interpretation. That is, that the city has ontological properties. That is, it shapes us. It shapes us. It shapes our vision. And then the city has also an epistemological impact. In other words, not only does it shape us and shape our vision, but it shapes our understanding and interpretation of one another, so that we are, as you say, at the neural level, we certainly are impacted by the channels and flows and stations and the commodity chains of the city, and even the commodity chains of the city that link the city to other places throughout the globe. Throughout the globe. What I'd like to do now is I'd like to switch gears a little bit, on account of time. I'd like to switch gears a little bit, and I'd like to share a quote from chapter 13. And the quote reads, the economy in the use of the means of production has to be considered under two separate aspects. First, as cheapening commodities, and thereby bringing about a fall in the value of labor power. Secondly, as altering the ratio of surplus value to the total capital advanced, i.e., the sum of the value of the constant and variable capital. So that as the school is destroyed, and as the Mexican rail industry is destroyed, right, and as corn production is more centralized here in the United States, as a matter of fact, that is, that as Mexico, as you say, becomes one of the primary importers of corn, and to the extent that U.S. Corn producers U.S. corn producing conglomerates become the channel through which corn is made, the channel through which corn makes its way into Mexico. It's to that extent, following the reading and understandings that are discussed and presented in chapter 13, it's to that extent that the value of workers in Mexico drops, or that rather that the value of work in Mexico drops within the context of the capitalist exploitative economy. And it's also to that extent that corn as a commodity is cheapened. It's to that extent that the properties inherent in the corn, its nutritive components, right, are reduced. It becomes an ever leading commodity, ever leading to PAP, P-A-P. It's just some a set of fibers that we consume, but have a reduced nutritive quality for our consumption. And so, I'm thinking about, and as I was reading this particular chapter, I was thinking about the set of arrangements that lead not just to price reduction, but also to the reduction in the value of labor, and of course, the cheapening of commodities in the economy, and as far as the cheapening of corn in society, and particularly the corn that Chicano and Mexican people more generally consume. And certainly it's not just Mexican origin people that consume corn. Of course, corn is now a global commodity, a global product, but corn has its origin in central Mexico, in the Mexican basin. And from there, it made its way out all over the American continent. Corn made its way as far north as Canada, and certainly as far south as Bolivia, and then of course into the Caribbean. So certainly corn has been marketized and traded, but following imperial presence of Spain, and then of course of other European nations and other European people in America, its marketization was channeled within capitalist circuits. Anyway, coming back to this particular question, I think that in order to examine these three questions, it's important that these questions be obtained from the category of terms with which we are already familiar: the shift from variable capital in the form of human labor power and technique to constant capital, that is the shift from variable capital to constant capital in the form of machinery and technology. Where in the first case, the space, time, and corresponding investments correspond to those factors within the context of variable capital, right, that are out of control, or more out of control, if not entirely out of control, more out of the control of capital. In the second case, it corresponds to those investments that are under capitalist control. And it's within that level of control that a new set of averages, about which we discussed last week, a new set of averages around cost and around production and around quality are created that elevate industrial advantage over workers, right? And that reduce and whose costs are reduced in the same industries. Thus, to the extent that one field of industry can outproduce another field of industry, it is under this system of production and its level of reduced cost to consumers, and also its level of reduced cost to capital, right? That is, that the economy that economic history is forged. Such history is characterized by reduced capacity to find secure employment, at least as far as labor is concerned, right? A greater penetration of technology in and out of the lives of workers, and the greater centralization of production. This has cultural ramifications, the kind of stuff that you were talking about just a few moments ago, Matt. This has cultural ramifications. Put differently, and to put it simply, right? The greater the degrees of surplus value, the lower the degrees of, and this is to use the language in this particular book, to the greater the degrees of surplus value, the lower the degrees of the collective power of the masses.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I think it's absolutely true. I mean, I think but I mean, but I think that the I mean, but it's an interplay though, because it is because they have no power that their labor is being exploited at that rate.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Is because they have no power that they're able to be exploited at a certain rate. It is because they have no power they're not being compensated in ways in which they um, can have, you know, a certain, that their wages won't provide a certain standard of living, let's say, right?
Yeah.
Because when we talk about like the rate of exploitation, sometimes I think it gets a little confused, because if you look at the rate of exploitation, you can make the argument that that an NBA player experiences a higher rate of exploitation than a sweatshop worker, right? I mean, I mean, if we're talking we're talking like sheer numbers, right?
Yeah.
And yet, a professional athlete enjoys a standard of living a sweatshop worker does not, right? You can make the argument that somebody working at Facebook experiences a rate of exploitation that you know, that somebody, you know, who works in a field, um,
Yeah.
numerically it's higher, because you know the amount of money that is being made off of the coding of the engine, you know, of a coding engineer at Facebook is really high. So let's say you're paying somebody $200,000 a year, that affords them a good standard of living. But you know, the amount of money you're making because they're working for you, numbers in the billions. I mean, we're talking about the fact that, you know, Facebook only has 5,000 employees, like technical employees, and they got all kinds of other people, but technical employees, they only employ about 5,000 people, and yet they're, you know, this globally huge corporation. Zuckerberg's was
Yeah.
something like, I know during the pandemic he made a lot of money, so I think he's now worth like 70 billion or something like this.
Yeah.
He's one of the biggest earners during the pandemic, along with Elon Musk and what's his name, the really famous Jeff Bezos.
Yeah.
You know, so you know, the fact of the matter is that, you know, they don't have that many technical employees, and yet they have billions of dollars made specifically from that labor. So the rate of exploitation of a Silicon Valley worker might actually be higher than that of a Central Valley worker. That said, that's all fine and well in theory. The reality of the way in which people live is quite different. It's quite different, and the lived reality is quite different. So it is because workers in, let's say, you know, professional athletes um, have flexed their power in the past, and because their skill is so rarefied that they're able to do certain things they are, and so they're able to, you know, okay, we're gonna do this, and it's gonna be that, and you're gonna do this, we're gonna do that. And if you want to take it more towards a regular working class experience, we could look at, like, you know, the port workers, you know, the stevedores, and people like that. Um, that would kind of almost fall, I don't want to say unskilled, but it would, because I don't, you know, use that kind of language, but that would fall into that kind of working class, that kind of like that kind of you know, these jobs are hard to come by, but they kind of fall within that kind of rubric, yet they're very well paid, because they have flexed their power. And should somebody, you know, should somebody not, you know, go along with the program, they could shut down a lot of commerce, right? So because of the odd position they are in within the economy, they have a lot of power. You know, they have a lot of power, and they have a lot of ability to organize and get things that they want, you know, within reason, within capitalist reason. So that's kind of interesting. I mean, even within farm labor itself, given the nature of the crop, the worker might have more power. You know, so like workers in Salinas, you know where you know where they grow certain crops. I mean, I remember hearing about this. We're actually get a higher wage than workers, including the Fresno and Central Valley area, because you know during particular crop seasons, because you know because of the crop, and if these people strike, we're not getting any harvest, right? So give there's all kinds of odd conditions that contribute to whether or not the laborer will be empowered. They're oftentimes outside of both the laborer and the capitalist's control.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's nature, it's time, it's the position of the point position.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's the rarity of the skill, but
Yeah.
um, but that's kind of yeah. There's all kinds of conditions that would determine that.
I'd like to,
But it's important not to lose sight of the fact that everyone's being exploited, including the labor of professional athletes, including Silicon Valley coders. I mean, you know,
yeah,
whatever criticism you might have of the tendencies of how these people act within society, that does not change. And then this is a really important fact in general too. Regardless of whatever criticisms you have of anybody, they are not. If they are a worker, they're not outside the bounds of capitalist exploitation. You might
yeah,
hate somebody for any given number of reasons, but that's not does not whatever you feel about them and whatever bad they may do in the world, it doesn't actually change the position that they are in with society. Because I mean, I think we have a really
yeah, yeah,
childish and silly way of looking at things in terms of political, in terms of our kind of political thought these days, where we find a reason why someone can be disqualified, and therefore, because they can be disqualified for whatever reason, that somehow changes the material position they are in within society. That
yeah,
doesn't
yeah,
change. I mean, it doesn't matter. That doesn't change. One fact doesn't change another. You know what I'm saying? Which not to say that you know, like the whatever reason someone's being disqualified could be valid or it could be slander. That would have to you have to examine case by case. But but if they can, let's say it's true, that does not change the fact that they're doesn't change the shape of society. You know what I'm saying? You know, it's and that's why you know doing this course in this class I think is very important to argue for a materialist reading of society, both so that we can advocate for something better in ways that will actually be clear, and
yeah,
also just to understand the world better. Because right now it's just a massive of willful ignorance and
and
self
praise
righteous.
ignorance. There's this praise of ignorance, you know.
Yeah,
I
this
think that
self
one of the,
righteous sound and fury, signifying nothing.
you know, it's one of the things that I think is important for folks to take into consideration as far as you know what we've just discussed is that the word exploitation uh, is has a particular meaning. The word exploitation has to do with the practice of extracting value from those who work and then monopolizing that value and centralizing that value, right, within the centers of the centers of power in the capitalist economy. And I think that oftentimes we use the word colloquially to mean physical injury or grief or suffering. And certainly there can't be exploitation without suffering and grief, right? But as all puppies are dogs, though not all dogs are puppies, right? It's very important to define and to objectively and materially understand the term exploitation. At the very least, the way in which we've been using it over the last 5 months or so, right? So yes, the basketball star or the baseball star who employs the guys that I grew up with to feed them on a daily basis, that is to go to their home and to prepare a meal, for instance. Even they, within this theoretical understanding of exploitation that we're talking about, even they are exploited. right? Though certainly the quality of their grief, the quality of their injury, and the levels of remuneration, that is payment for that grief and suffering, is different. Anyway, I won't get into brain injuries and knee injuries, for at least not today. We'll talk about it later. But in any case,
I mean, another comparison would be, you know, to the coders of the Silicon Valley. I mean, that's another example of people that are highly compensated, and yet
absolutely,
technical question of exploitation. But we have a comment here that says that the rate of exploitation of farm workers is screwed because this work makes other work possible. This work adds far more value to society than the AG companies are making. And so I think that's really, I mean, that's something not to lose sight of, is that
absolutely.
We talk about farm work and just extractive labor in general. It is the labor that makes other labor possible.
Yeah.
And it's always been that way. And it's typically the people who are subject to a kind of a colonial relationship with the economy that make up the bulk of extractive labor, whether living in their home countries or being part of a diaspora. They typically make up the bulk of people working and forced to work in extractive labor. And so that really, that's the shape of the world, the shape of the economy.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, before we get into your poetry, now that we're at the tail end of our discussion this morning, Matt, what I'd like to do is I'd like to return to something that you mentioned at the outset of our discussion concerning how it is we view ourselves and how it is we view the world in which we live, and would reduce the fit of the world to the frames, right, that shape the parameters and the distribution of the windows, of our homes. We might then consider for a moment the ontological, and here are the words that I think are important for us to take into consideration. Ontology to mean the source of understanding, and epistemology to mean the interpretation and the study of interpretations, right? That are generated in these particular areas that we inhabit. That is, that we ought to understand or consider the ontological and epistemological implications of this particular chapter. If having changed the nature of the economy in such a fashion as to elevate surplus value, and if humanity at the same time changes its own nature, and here I'm making reference to ontology, and if these changes have taken place, as has been the case with humanity, and as Marx illustrated concerning Aristotle's blindness, that is, it is the alienated conditions of humanity that prevent it from discovering the truth of things, then how is it that we are to make sense of where all of this fits and where we are together living? That is, where we live together. How do we make sense of where it is we live, and how it is that together it is we understand what we see, or how it is together that we come to believe that it is what we see? Capitalism, seen this way, is a ruling logic. It's at the very least, to the extent that we misrecognize, to the extent that we don't confront capitalism, to the extent that we accept things as a quote unquote are, and that we don't examine the history of things and our fetishization for corn, for instance, or our fetishization for cotton. It's to that extent that we leave things, arrangements and understandings to capital, that we are blinded from history. What do you think? And then leading into your poetry, please, Matt.
No, I think that's very poetic. I mean, the kind of I mean, no, that's a combination of corn and cotton. I've never really heard anyone say that before. I'm gonna steal that. So my mind is racing with that.
Yeah,
About cotton. I mean the most obvious thing with corn. I mean the thing that really is that corn is kind of this natural thing that grows, or it's not natural, but I mean this thing that has been developed over
yeah.
time,
Or it's
right?
not natural anymore to the extent that it's GMOified, right?
Yeah, right. And it's become corn syrup, right? Corn has become corn
Yeah,
syrup, and
pap, pap.
yeah. So
Yeah,
the kind of de-evolution from corn and all its variants to just corn being one way, to from corn being as it was to corn becoming corn on the cob and only the yellow corn,
yeah,
to corn becoming corn syrup. It's kind of it shows you what capitalism does to the world, and what it does to the people
yeah,
living in it. It's pretty, you know,
yeah,
the
yeah,
assault upon corn. It's kind of the story of at least a large portion of the story of the Western Hemisphere.
yeah,
All
yeah, yeah.
right, so should I do this poem?
Yes, please. And I don't know if folks are hearing it, but there's some construction taking place or some demolition taking place in my neighborhood, and it's in my ear. I don't know if it's in others' ears.
This is kind of an epic poem. It's about an odd but brilliant man living in the San Gabriel Valley. Would you like to hear it?
Go ahead.
It's called Precarious Rex.
Ah,
We live in epic. There we go. There is no democracy in the way of things. There is no democracy in the way of things. There is no democracy in the way of things, and torture the hands moved by the engine of the clock, the world as it is, whether you like it or not. For all the world's a cage, and we men and women merely its prisoners, and one man in his time can do many bids as his time begins, and name and birth certificate with the measurement of infant, with a doctor's swift hand, a first scene of public humiliation, the very first act. Welcome to the world, baby. You ain't seen nothing yet. Then on to schoolyard and lunchbox, and off to factory feed and process, bright face, clean teeth, amongst others, new to the fact that there is no democracy in the way of things. Then on to the fighter, the lover, soldier, company man, true believer, full of strange and tragic oaths to a world of jealous competition. Oh, how he shall live. Firm now in the fact that one day he shall die, how he shall dream, how he shall strive. Then on to eyes wise with familiarity that like cancer grows, as imagination bends with the spine in his last years, dead man walking, voice trembling, silence encroaching, eyes fading, failure coming into view. As time served ends this strange, eventful history, just as it began, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, oblivion to oblivion, imprisoned, leaving nothing behind but measurements to be weighed, documented by doctor's certificate. But let us not begin or end this journey in such morbid fashion. Let's instead join our hero midstream, some dash dream, somewhere between realization and acceptance, somewhere in the way of things. Enter stage left, precarious Rex, the king of debt, brown bagging on a splintered park bench, man of letters, adjunct professor in the valley of a saint named for an avenging angel. So all that went wrong. I made my way to the corner of Mission in the Sea, leaving the steps of the library, not the jailers, though I am no stranger to either long-standing, altogether far too public institutions of coercion and correction. It was here in the early hours of sun that, en route to a familiar spot, a favorite park along my morning constitutional killing time, reviving dreams, waiting upon some happier hour, hailing from some brighter horizon, a round or two of catching up with an old colleague, where and when occurred is the wrong word, and this I mean to be precise, lest you get the wrong impression. Like so much in life, it was a thought returned. More on this phantom later. Allow my neurons to gather. Let us instead pose the question: how often, with what mystery do thoughts recur, and how and when and what frequency do they begin to shape the mind? These are questions with answers, and in them the composite and contours of a life. So heed this advice, be guarded with that which enters your eyes, for the stage doth inform the play. Falling asleep in public is an art, not a science. I woke up 3 rows removed from the next living soul, checked my pockets, losing ticket secure. My father would slap my face where you see how his money exchanged our palms, only to drift with gentle ease into a welcome breeze, the revelry of a Tuesday afternoon. More on him later. For now, let us consider a strange slice of eventful history of one Lucky Baldwin, born in the final year of Jacksonian democracy with all its promise of land theft and libertine debauchery. When asked for a defining legacy, he pointed to the Santa Anita racetracks and said, "This was it. Elias Jackson Lucky Baldwin was one of the early American pioneers of underpaying Mexicans, a tradition with which my labor is no stranger, and a practice which my employers, both prior and current, have proven themselves not only to be the most rant enthusiasts, but also amongst the most ardent of practitioners. Bring on the nights, the after-work bar rush, the shaking of dust, that rat race towards dusk, because the thought that plagued my mind on this eerie, uneventful morning could use some drinking away. There is far too much death in this valley, far too many odes to the odious, the murderous, the pious pirates of land, speculators, barons, shaping the architecture that hangs overhead, where you see fit to judge this vagabond, vagrant descendant of subjects of California law at the intersection of the mission system and Route 66, will judge as you must. Me, I prefer to run, for all the world's a tavern. And on this evening, such as this, on a dare, a cantina, and we men and women merely its patrons, we have our entrances, our exits, sometimes sooner than expected, a toast to our mothers, our fathers, our lovers, our teachers, our cynics, our resistance to the instructions they gave us, our doubters and listers, true believers, our most vicious detractors who say just about anything about us, to all these strange, eventful combinations, real and imagined, to those who would seek to understand, to dismiss or understand us, to the interrogation and ignorers, saboteurs and supporters, to the degrees on the wall and the check in the mail, lift your glass. Salute. May we live to outrun them all. My God, it's been so long. Let us leave something to be said for the evening. Let us not prematurely dip into that pit of profundity, our strange, tragic greatest. It's a review of all the life and surroundings to which you and I have both borne witness. Let the conversation renew. Let us speak of the world, its state of affairs, their driving forces, prevailing interests, cause and effect, historic development, the news of the day, and such. Some colleague, a contemporary that some might argue, and I might rightly concur, has been the subject, the recipient of far too public, and might I quite add, quite unmerited praise and success. And of course, let us discuss how little democracy there is in the way of things. And I tell you all this and more life could afford, but instead, the greater dissatisfaction of patrons, prisoners, participants, and audience, the specter of commerce haunted the conversation. Just imagine such an invitation only met with the attempts to be roped in by some distant friend. That time is shaped into an acquaintance, into some type of academic pyramid scheme, a tenure track position in Carbondale, Illinois. I would rather die 1,000 deaths in all the chain restaurants in Monrovia than I woke up in the back of a car ride share. Better there than the jailers, I suppose, though I could not help but wonder if I left of my own volition. Check my pockets, losing tickets still in place. I am, after all, a fool of odd and somewhat tragic sentiments. I checked my phone for the time, my destination, 7:30 p.m., childhood home. His fellow traveler appeared in no mood for engagement of any sort. I closed my eyes once more for a chance to dream. When half asleep, my aspirations seemed within reach. Life should not be this hard. Just the driver and I do not wish him to feel compelled, but nonetheless, strike up friendly conversation. He tells me he has 3 children and tells me he hails from Michoacan. I lie. I tell him so do my parents. He asks if I ever been. I have, in fact. So in this instance, I tell the truth because it is convenient. Then I tell him that I'm a professor and a highly regarded, successful author, hailed by my peers and critics alike. And with the light in his eyes, I decide to comprise a compromise between the lies he needs to hear and the ones I need to tell. I tell him my father is proud of me. I tell him that I am what I am made possible through sacrifice, that I am the dreams of my parents purchased through their waking blood and sweat, and that any time I think of them, it brings a tear to my eye. I tell him that his children can be anything to which they set their mind. We reach Baldwin Park, and where my father no longer hides his contempt. As my mother prepares a plate, she asks about an American friend, by which she means white. I tell her about a full-time position in Southern Illinois that I am very, very seriously considering. She nearly begins to cry, runs out the room to tell my father the news. I can hear as he says he will believe it when he sees it. My eyes are heavy in this familiar setting, filled with photographs, the strange, eventful beginnings of me. Alongside oil paintings, portraits of the family, legends of the home country, the pride of Cuauhtemoc, the folly of Juan Diego, a framed copy of my master's, somewhere in between. There is no democracy in the way of things.
It's, I think, a poem for, I think it's a poem to be read for the folks in many different fields and very many different disciplines, certainly. And I'm curious as to its reception in one particular discipline, the discipline of Chicana and Chicano study. I look forward to a discussion about this particular poem. Very excited. Well, Matt, time's up. We'll be discussing chapter 14 and trudging along next time we meet. And I will, as folks know, I see no questions on my screen on account of our arrangement now. But I'll respond offline, and as I have been, I want to thank everybody. I know Karina has helped out in putting this together as well. So special shout out to her. And okay, big hugs and to everyone, and appreciate it. I appreciate my time with you as always, Matt. And I'm very excited about the work that we've been doing and we'll continue to do. Okay, all right.